The wind had been circling the coast since dawn, not angry yet, just restless, like an animal testing the edges of its cage. Gray light slid across the water and climbed the dunes, revealing the town in fragments. A leaning pier, shuttered windows, a road washed pale by salt. Eli Mercer stood at the end of that road, boots planted, hands empty, listening to the breath of the sea as if it might explain itself. He was a man shaped by absence. People said he was quiet, but quietness implied peace, and Eli had none. He carried his days the way others carried weather, with a practiced vigilance that assumed damage would arrive eventually. His house waited behind him. Cedar boards dulled by years of storms, a place that smelled of old rope and extinguished fires. Inside were rooms that had learned how to hold their breath. He had come out that morning to secure loose planks before the warning sirens began. The radio had spoken of wind speed and surge, of names assigned to storms as if familiarity could make them gentler. Eli did not fear hurricanes. He feared the silence that followed them, the way loss announced itself only after the noise was gone. He worked without hurry, moving through the tasks like a ritual meant to keep memory at bay. The sound reached him as he bent to tie a line. It was thin, almost swallowed by the wind, a sound that might have been nothing if he had wanted it to be. Eli straightened, listening again, heart tightening despite himself. The sound came once more, uneven, human. It rose from the direction of the old boathouse, the one that had collapsed years earlier and never been cleared because no one claimed it anymore. He told himself to finish the knot. He told himself the coast was full of echoes, yet his feet were already moving, carrying him toward the boathouse as if they remembered a promise he had forgotten. The fog thickened as he walked, beating on his lashes, blurring the edges of the world until it was only the sand beneath him and the sound ahead. Inside the boathouse, daylight fell through broken boards and pale slats. The air smelled of rot and seawater. And there, against the far wall, was the girl. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, hair plastered dark against her face, eyes too large for the rest of her. A torn backpack lay open beside her, spilling a single shoe and a notebook swollen with water. They regarded each other in silence. Eli felt the old reflex to step back, to give distance to danger, but the danger here was not teeth or waves. It was the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that once you saw something like this, you were changed by it. The girl did not cry or speak. She watched him with a stillness that suggested practice. The wind struck the boathouse, rattling the boards. Eli crouched slowly, lowering himself to her level without thinking, the way he once had with a frightened dog. He noticed her hands first, scraped and shaking, then the thinness of her wrists, the bruise blooming like a storm cloud along her arm. Anger rose in him, sharp and unfamiliar, followed by fear that he might not be equal to it. Sirens wailed in the distance, their hollow notes threading through the fog. Evacuation, shelter, protocol. The words lined up in his mind, sensible and clean. He imagined walking away, telling himself someone else would come, that systems existed for this reason. The girl shifted then, just slightly, her fingers tightening around the strap of the backpack. The movement felt like a question. Eli stood. He removed his jacket, the old one with tear at the elbow, and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at the touch of fabric, but did not pull away. The jacket swallowed her, a borrowed warmth. Outside, the wind gathered itself, finding its voice at last. He led her out of the boathouse, not touching her, only gesturing, letting her choose each step. The town looked different with her beside him, every broken thing newly accusatory. People were already leaving, cars loaded, faces turned forward. No one noticed them. The girl kept her gaze on the ground, as if the earth were safer than the sky. At his house, Eli lit the fireplace and set a kettle on the stove. The simple act steadied him. He showed her the bathroom, the couch, the blanket folded at the armrest. He spoke only when necessary, his voice low, careful not to fracture the fragile space forming between them. She sat where he indicated, hands tucked into the sleeves of his jacket, watching the flames. The hurricane arrived faster than predicted. Wind slammed the walls, rain lashed the windows, and the power failed with a sound like a sigh. The house trembled. Eli felt the old urge to retreat inward, to become smaller than the storm. Then the girl made a sound, a raw, tearing cry that cut through the wind and lodged in his chest. He sat beside her on the floor, back against the couch, close enough that she could feel him there. He did not reach for her. He stayed. The storm howled, demanding attention, but something quieter took hold, something steady and unyielding. The girl leaned into his shoulder, her weight sudden and absolute. Eli closed his eyes, bracing for pain that did not come. He realized then that the conflict was no longer the storm outside, but the one he carried, the lifelong habit of leaving before being needed. Keeping her safe meant staying visible, accountable, present in a town that remembered his losses. It meant reopening rooms, answering questions, risking attachment. The wind eased, but the choice did not. As neighbors emerged to survey damage, Eli felt their glances drift toward his porch. He did not turn away. He stepped forward, shielding the girl with his body, discovering a courage that felt borrowed yet unmistakably his. It terrified him, and somehow, impossibly, it also made him feel alive again. When morning broke, the world lay altered but intact. The wind had spent itself. Light returned in careful increments. Eli opened the door and breathed in the clean, bruised air. Behind him, the girl stood in the doorway, wrapped in his jacket, watching the day begin. For the first time in years, Eli felt the future press close, not as a threat, but as a question he was willing to answer. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet urgency, as if time itself had learned to move softly around the house. Eli woke before dawn each morning, not from habit but from awareness, the subtle knowledge that he was no longer alone. The girl slept on the couch wrapped in layered blankets, her breathing shallow yet steady, one hand always curled into the fabric of his jacket. He watched her from the doorway with the cautious reverence usually reserved for things that could vanish if observed too closely. He made breakfast without asking if she was hungry. He simply placed a bowl of oatmeal on the table and stepped away. When he returned later, the bowl was empty, the spoon rinsed and set carefully by the sink. The smallest gestures began to speak for her, each one in answer to a question he had not dared ask. She moved through the house like a visitor afraid of breaking something sacred, touching walls, windows, the edge of the table, as if cataloging proof that this place was real. Outside, the town labored through its recovery. Roofs were tarped, boats hauled back into position, debris stacked into neat, hopeful piles. People nodded at Eli now, their expressions altered by curiosity and something gentler. He felt their questions but did not invite them inside. Protection came instinctively, a reflex he had not known he possessed. When a neighbor asked about the girl, Eli replied only that she was safe. It felt like a vow. The girl watched on the porch as children passed on their bikes, their laughter threading briefly through the air before fading. Once, she lifted her hand halfway, then let it fall. Eli noticed without comment. That night, he left a notebook and a pencil beside her blanket. In the morning, the first page held a single drawing, a house with smoke rising from its chimney, the line shaky but determined. As the week wore on, the storm's aftermath receded into memory, replaced by routines that settled like silt. Eli repaired what he could, leaving her within sight, never questioning her need to see him. She followed him to the shoreline one afternoon, keeping several steps back. The ocean was calmer now, deceptively gentle. She stood watching the waves, shoulders tense, until Eli sat on a driftwood log and waited. Slowly, she joined him. The distance between them closed not by intention, but by gravity. That was when he noticed a scar at her hairline, pale and thin. He did not ask. Some truths arrived only when they were ready. Instead, he spoke of the tides, of how the water remembered the moon. His voice was even, unadorned. She listened, eyes fixed on the horizon, absorbing the sound more than the words. When a gull cried overhead, she startled, then steadied, her breath evening out as if she had borrowed his calm. The town children began leaving things on the porch. A knitted scarf, a jar of seashells, a note written in uneven block letters that read, "For your friend." The girl touched each offering with solemn care, arranging them on the windowsill like talismans. Eli felt something loosen in his chest. The town was not intruding. It was extending itself quietly, respectfully, as if understanding the fragility of what was forming. One evening, the power flickered back on. Lights blinked to life. Radios crackled, normalcy knocking gently at the door. The girl flinched at the sudden noise, retreating into herself. Eli turned the lights off again, plunging the house back into lamplit safety. He sat across from her, the table between them, and for the first time allowed himself to look fully at her face. There was resilience there, etched beneath the fear, a strength sharpened by necessity. He recognized it because it mirrored his own. He realized then that the conflict had shifted. The storm was no longer wind and water. It was a choice to remain open in a world that taught retreat. Caring for her meant inviting the town into a story he had tried to end years ago. It meant allowing hope to take root where grief had long reigned. The realization frightened him more than a hurricane ever had. That night, she spoke her first word. It was barely audible, a thread of sound woven with effort. She said his name, not as a question, but as an anchor. Eli felt the sound settle into him, reshaping something fundamental. He answered her simply, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Later, as he stood at the window, watching the moon climb free of the clouds, he sensed the town settling into sleep around them, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place. Behind him, the girl slept deeply for the first time, the notebook tucked beneath her arm. Eli understood that what they had begun was fragile, unfinished, and irreversible. The future no longer felt like an empty stretch to be endured, but a widening path, illuminated just enough to take the next step. Morning arrived without ceremony, a thin ribbon of light slipping through the curtains and settling across the floor. Eli noticed it because he was awake, sitting at the table with his hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted not by fear, but by vigilance, the quiet responsibility of listening for another person's breath. When he finally stood, his joints protested, reminding him that change always exacted a physical toll. The girl was already awake. She sat on the couch with her feet tucked beneath her, the notebook open on her lap. This time, the pages held more than shapes. There were attempted words, letters uneven and brave, written as if each one required permission to exist. Eli did not read them aloud. He understood that being seen did not always mean being spoken into. Instead, he nodded once, a gesture of recognition, and went to make breakfast. They ate together now, not facing each other but sharing the same space, a small but significant shift. Outside, a pickup slowed near the house. Eli watched through the window as Mrs. Calder stepped out, her gray hair pulled back, her movements deliberate. She carried a basket. Eli hesitated, feeling the familiar urge to shield, then opened the door. Mrs. Calder did not look past him. She handed over the basket and said only, "Soup, for both of you." Then she left, her footsteps unhurried, as if trust were a language she spoke fluently. The girl touched the basket after the door closed, her fingers lingering on the woven handle. Eli felt the weight of the moment settle between them. The town was no longer a distant backdrop. It was leaning in, careful not to startle. He wondered how many people had been waiting for something like this, a reason to soften. That afternoon, Eli took her to the edge of town, to the small field where the grass grew stubborn and wild. A group of teenagers were there, repairing a fence knocked down by the storm. They paused when they saw her, their expressions uncertain. Eli felt the tension coil in his chest. Before he could redirect them, one of the boys set his hammer down and offered a wave, awkward and sincere. The girl hesitated, then lifted her hand, just enough. The wave was returned, multiplied, and the moment passed without spectacle. Eli exhaled, realizing how much he had been holding. As days gathered, the girl's presence altered the rhythm of his life. He found himself planning meals, adjusting schedules, noticing the weather not as a threat, but as context. She followed him into town once, staying close, her shoulder brushing his arm whenever the sidewalk narrowed. At the hardware store, the clerk rang up supplies without comment, slipping a small bag of nails across the counter with a wink meant only for Eli. Kindness, he was learning, did not always announce itself. The girl began to speak more, not in full sentences, but in fragments offered like gifts, names of objects, questions about birds. One evening, she asked why storms were named. Eli considered the question longer than necessary, then said that people named storms to feel less powerless against them. She absorbed this, nodding slowly, as if filing it away for later use. The realization came to him gradually, assembling itself from moments like these. The central conflict was no longer about whether he could protect her from the world, but whether he could allow the world to touch them both without retreating. Each interaction tested his resolve, asked him to choose presence over avoidance. The stakes felt higher because the reward was no longer abstract. It slept under his roof, trusted his silence, wrote its future in pencil. One night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, the girl stood beside him at the sink. She pointed to her drawing of the house, now surrounded by figures holding hands. She tapped one figure, then another, then pressed her finger to his chest. Eli felt something break open, a quiet fracture that let warmth spill through. He understood then that healing was not a solitary act, but a shared one, built slowly through consent and care. Later, after she had gone to bed, Eli stepped onto the porch. The town lay quiet, stitched together by lights and stories. He felt the weight of responsibility settle into something steadier, something that resembled purpose. The storm had brought destruction, yes, but it had also stripped away his defenses, leaving him exposed to connection. As he stood there, listening to the night, he knew there was no turning back. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was illuminated by the simple, profound truth that staying had already changed everything. The change did not announce itself all at once. It arrived in increments, so small they could be mistaken for coincidence. A knock at the door just after dusk. A pair of boots left neatly on the porch, mended and returned without explanation. A neighbor lingering longer than necessary, as if the air around the house had grown warmer than the rest of town. Eli noticed these things the way sailors notice shifts in wind, not with alarm, but with attention. The girl noticed him too. She began to sit closer to the window in the evenings, watching silhouettes pass along the road. Her shoulders no longer tightened at every sound. Instead, she tilted her head, curious, measuring the world as if deciding whether it might be safe enough to enter. Eli never urged her forward. He understood now that healing moved best when it was not chased. One afternoon, a boy from the field appeared at the gate, his bicycle tipped onto the grass. He held out a small wooden carving, rough but earnest, shaped like a bird in mid-flight. He did not speak to Eli. He crouched instead, extending the offering toward the girl with careful hands. She studied the carving, then took it, her fingers brushing his. The contact was brief, electric. The boy smiled, mounted his bike, and rode away. The girl stood very still, staring at the bird as if it had flown straight into her chest. That night, she placed the carving beside the other objects on the windowsill. The collection had grown into a quiet testament. Shells, notes, drawings, a scarf. Eli saw in it a map of connection, each item a bridge laid gently across distance. He realized the house had become something else entirely, no longer just shelter, but a point of gathering gravity. The town began to adjust its orbit. People stopped by under the pretense of repairs, of borrowed tools, of checking the weather. They spoke softly, respecting the unspoken boundaries. The girl listened from the edges, absorbing tone and intent. She asked questions later, her voice gaining strength with each one. Why did people bring things? Why did they smile like that? Eli answered honestly, telling her that sometimes people help because they remembered needing help themselves. The true test came on a morning thick with fog, when a social worker arrived unannounced. Her car was official, her posture professional, her eyes kind but assessing. Eli felt the old fear surge, the instinct to close ranks, to guard what had been entrusted to him. The girl retreated behind him, her hand finding the back of his shirt, gripping hard. They sat at the table. The woman spoke carefully, asking questions that hovered just short of accusation. Eli answered what he could, withholding nothing essential, offering context instead of defense. He did not raise his voice. He did not apologize for caring. When the woman asked the girl her name, there was a long pause. Eli felt the moment stretch, fragile as glass. The girl spoke then, clear and steady. She said her name and said she was safe. She said it while standing beside him, not hidden, not afraid. The words seemed to change the room, settling into the walls like a blessing. The social worker nodded, something softening in her expression. She promised a return to help navigate what came next. And when she left, the fog lifted slightly, as if the world had exhaled. Eli closed the door and leaned against it, his legs suddenly unsteady. The girl watched him, then did something unexpected. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek into his side. The gesture was unpracticed, imperfect, and it undid him completely. He rested his hand on her back, feeling the truth of her presence anchor him to the moment. From that day on, the house became a quiet refuge not just for them, but for others who sensed what it offered. An old veteran came by in the evenings, sitting on the porch without speaking, leaving calmer than he arrived. A young mother lingered one afternoon, tears slipping free as she watched the girl draw at the table. No one named what was happening. Naming it might have made it fragile. Eli began to understand that the storm had not ended when the winds died. It had simply changed form, moving inward, reshaping lives in its wake. The central conflict sharpened into focus. Whether he could sustain this openness without losing himself, whether care could endure without becoming sacrifice. The girl, in her quiet resilience, seemed to sense his doubt. One evening, as the sun bled orange into the sea, she brought him the notebook. On the last page, she had written a sentence, the letters careful and sure. It said, "We are still here." Eli felt the words settle deep, answering questions he had not known how to ask. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just a child he was protecting, but a person choosing to stay. As night fell, the town lights blinked on one by one. The house glowed among them, a steady point against the dark. Eli understood then that whatever came next would be larger than either of them, shaped by many hands and many hearts. The thought did not frighten him. It filled him with a cautious, exhilarating resolve. The storm had revealed its purpose, and he was ready at last to meet it. The idea took shape without a name, forming slowly in the spaces between visits and silences. Eli did not announce it, did not sketch plans or seek permission. He simply kept the door open. Chairs multiplied on the porch. The kettle stayed warm longer. People arrived with the tentative hope of those who had learned disappointment by heart, and left with their shoulders eased, their steps lighter, as if something unseen had shifted inside them. The girl moved among them with growing ease. She no longer hovered at the edges, no longer flinched at sudden laughter. She listened, absorbed, offered small smiles that landed like gifts. When the veteran came, she brought him tea without being asked. When the young mother returned, she handed over a drawing of a bird flying low over water. These gestures were wordless, precise, and powerful. Eli watched, humbled by how naturally she gave what she herself had needed most. The town responded in kind. A carpenter reinforced the porch without charging a cent. Mrs. Calder organized meals that appeared on the table without explanation. The teenagers in the field fixed a fence and lingered, talking softly about nothing and everything. No one called it a project. No one spoke of charity. It was simply understood that this place mattered. Eli felt the pull of something larger taking hold. He began to clear the unused room at the back of the house, the one he had kept closed since the loss that had once hollowed him out. Dust rose as he opened the door, motes catching the light like tiny revelations. He worked slowly, reverently, as if apologizing to the past for finally letting go. When the room was ready, he placed a small table inside, a lamp, a stack of notebooks. It became a space for quiet conversations, for listening without fixing. The girl watched him transform the room, her expression thoughtful. One evening, she stood in the doorway and asked what it was for. Eli considered the question, then answered simply that it was for people who needed a place to breathe. She nodded, satisfied, and brought one of her drawings to tape on the wall. The image was of a house with many doors, all open. The turning point came on a night heavy with heat, the air thick and restless. A storm brewed offshore, distant thunder rolling like memory. A man arrived at the gate, soaked with sweat and fear, his eyes too bright. He spoke of nights without sleep, of dreams that would not release him. Eli invited him in without hesitation. The girl retreated to the couch, watching, learning. They sat in the quiet room, the storm's distant pulse underscoring the man's words. Eli listened, saying little, offering presence instead of solutions. Hours passed. When the man finally left, his shoulders were no longer hunched, his breath steadier. He paused at the door, turned, and said he would sleep that night. Eli believed him. Later, as rain began to fall in earnest, the girl joined Eli on the porch. Thunder cracked closer now, the sky alive with light. She did not flinch. She leaned against him, her head resting easily on his arm. He realized then that the legacy forming here was not built of walls or programs, but of moments like this, shared and unguarded. The storm broke over the town, fierce but brief. When it passed, the air cooled, the world rinsed clean. Eli felt the familiar fear rise, then recede. This time, the storm had not taken anything. It had only reminded him of how far he had come. In the days that followed, more people came. Some stayed an hour. Some stayed a lifetime's worth of minutes. The girl began to laugh, the sound surprising them both. Eli felt the last of his resistance soften into something like faith. He understood now that purpose was not a destination, but a practice, renewed each time he chose to remain present. One evening, as the sun sank low in the house filled with quiet voices, Eli caught the girl watching him. Her gaze was steady, sure. She said with calm certainty that this was home. The words settled between them, solid and true. Eli looked around at the gathered people, the open doors, the light spilling out into the dusk, and felt the story widen beyond his imagining. The storm had given him this, and he would not turn away. Time moved differently once the word home had been spoken. It did not rush forward anymore, nor did it circle the past with sharp teeth. It stretched, generous and patient, allowing moments to deepen rather than disappear. Eli felt in the mornings when he woke without the familiar weight on his chest, and in the evenings when the house held more than silence without feeling crowded. The girl began calling him by his name more often, each time with greater ease, as if practicing ownership of something stable. Her voice strengthened in increments, gaining texture and confidence. She asked questions that revealed curiosity instead of fear. Why people left and came back. Why some storms destroyed and others only frightened. Eli answered as best he could, admitting when he didn't know. He learned that honesty, even imperfect, was its own form of safety. The quiet room filled more frequently now, sometimes with conversation, sometimes with nothing at all. People sat across from Eli or beside him, learning that they did not need to perform their pain to be heard. The girl often lingered nearby, drawing or reading, her presence a reminder that healing did not always announce itself with words. The veteran slept in the chair one afternoon, his breathing deep and untroubled, and when he woke, tears slid down his weathered face without apology. Eli noticed how the town began to reference the house, not as his, but as that place. Directions were given in relation to it. Turn left after that place. Meet me near that place. It had become a landmark not of geography, but of meaning. The realization humbled him. He had not built this intentionally. He had simply stayed when leaving would have been easier. The girl's drawings evolved. The lines grew surer, the figures more detailed. She began sketching people she recognized. Mrs. Calder with her basket, the teenagers at the fence, the man who finally slept. She taped the drawings along the hallway, creating a living record of connection. Eli walked past them each day, reminded that the story was no longer his alone. One afternoon, the social worker returned, this time without a clipboard. She sat at the table, accepted tea, and listened. The girl spoke freely now, explaining how she felt safe, how she liked the quiet room, how storms no longer felt like the end of things. The woman nodded, eyes shining. She spoke of options, of steps forward, but her tone carried no urgency. She understood that rushing this would fracture something rare. After she left, Eli and the girl walked to the shoreline. The water was calm, the horizon clear. They stood side by side, watching the tide pull back, revealing shells and stones hidden moments before. Eli realized that this was what had happened to him. The The storm had receded just enough to show what lay beneath, a capacity for care he had buried in self-preservation. The girl slipped her hand into his. The gesture was casual now, unremarkable, and that was what made it extraordinary. Eli felt the truth settle in him, quiet and unshakable. Whatever came next, paperwork, plans, uncertainties, they would face it anchored to this place and each other.